My name is Whitney Johnson. I'm 28 years old, and after winning $1.6 million in the state lottery, my own family pressured me into investing every penny in my Uncle Roger's revolutionary real estate company that turned out to be an elaborate Ponzi scheme. When it all collapsed and everyone lost their money, instead of apologizing for manipulating me into financial ruin, they blamed me for being too trusting and treated me like I was the criminal who had destroyed their lives. What they didn't know was that their victim blaming and emotional manipulation was being carefully documented by someone who understood financial crimes better than they realized, and their cruelty was about to cost them everything they thought they could steal from me. I had been working as a bank teller at First National Bank for 6 years, living in a modest one-bedroom apartment, and driving a 10-year-old Honda Civic that I had bought used with my own savings. My life was simple, predictable, and financially stable in the way that comes from understanding money and living within your means. Every week for 4 years, I had played the same lottery numbers: my birthday, my grandmother's birthday, and the anniversary of my college graduation, never expecting to win but enjoying the small weekly ritual that gave me something to hope for. The morning I discovered I had won $1. $6 million. I was getting ready for work when I checked my phone and saw the winning numbers posted. I stared at my ticket for 10 minutes, checking and rechecking the numbers, convinced I was making some kind of mistake. But there they were, my numbers, perfectly matching the jackpot combination that would change everything about my life. My first instinct was caution and careful planning, exactly what you'd expect from someone who worked in banking and understood how quickly money could disappear if not managed properly. I called in sick to work, drove to the lottery office, and spent the entire day meeting with financial advisors and learning about my options for claiming the prize. I chose the lump sum payment of $960,000 after taxes, and I was already making mental plans for investing conservatively, paying off my student loans, and maybe buying a modest house. But the moment news of my lottery win became public through the required press announcement, my phone started ringing constantly with calls from family members I hadn't heard from in months. Suddenly, everyone was interested in my well-being, my plans for the future, and most importantly, my strategies for managing my newfound wealth. "Whitney, honey, we're so excited for you," my mother Carol called within hours of the public announcement. "Your father and I have been discussing this windfall, and we think you should really consider letting us help you manage this money. You're young and inexperienced with this kind of wealth, and there are so many ways you could make costly mistakes." The suggestion that I was too young and inexperienced to manage money was particularly irritating since I worked in banking and had been managing my own finances successfully for years. But Carol wasn't finished with her unsolicited advice and barely disguised attempts to gain control over my lottery winnings. "We've been talking to your Uncle Roger about investment opportunities," she continued, "and he has some amazing ideas about how you could turn this lottery money into much more through smart business investments. He's been so successful with his real estate development company." Uncle Roger Johnson was Carol's younger brother, a smooth-talking man in his 50s who always seemed to be involved in some new business venture that was going to make him rich. Over the years, I had heard stories about his various schemes: importing businesses, restaurant franchises, cryptocurrency investments, but I had never seen evidence of any substantial success from these ventures. "Mom, I appreciate the concern, but I'm planning to invest conservatively and focus on long-term financial security," I replied, hoping to discourage further discussion about letting family members manage my money. "Whitney, you can't just put this money in savings accounts and certificates of deposit," my father Dennis interjected when he got on the phone. "With this kind of windfall, you have an opportunity to set yourself up for life if you make smart investment decisions. Roger has connections and experience that could multiply your winnings significantly." Have you ever noticed how winning money suddenly makes everyone an expert on what you should do with it? That's exactly what I was experiencing as family members who had never shown interest in financial planning suddenly became investment advisors with strong opinions about my lottery prize. Over the next week, the pressure intensified as more family members called to congratulate me on my win, while subtly suggesting that I needed their guidance to avoid making expensive mistakes with my prize money. The underlying message was always the same: I was too young, too inexperienced, and too naive to handle this kind of wealth without family supervision. "Whitney, lottery winners lose their money all the time because they don't understand investing," my cousin Patricia warned during one of many unsolicited phone calls. "You need to work with family members who care about your future and want to see you succeed." The parade of phone calls culminated in Roger himself, reaching out to arrange a meeting where he could present his business opportunity, and explain how my lottery winnings could be transformed into long-term wealth through his real estate development company. "Whitney, I've been following your lottery win with great excitement," Roger said during our phone conversation. "I have an incredible opportunity that could turn your $960,000 into several million dollars over the next few years through luxury resort development in emerging markets." The promise of turning my lottery winnings into several million dollars was tempting, but my banking background had taught me to be skeptical of investment opportunities that promised unusually high returns without corresponding risks. "Roger, what kind of returns are you projecting, and what are the risks involved?" I asked, trying to gather basic information about his investment proposal. "We're conservatively projecting 40% annual returns based on the explosive growth in luxury tourism markets," Roger replied with confidence. "The risks are minimal because we're working with established developers and focusing on properties in stable political environments." The promise of 40% annual returns immediately raised red flags for me, since I knew from my banking experience that legitimate investments rarely offered such high returns without significant risks. But Roger was prepared for skepticism and had apparently developed sophisticated materials to support his claims. "I'd like to show you our business plan, financial projections, and testimonials from current investors," Roger continued. "I think once you see the documentation, you'll understand why this opportunity is perfect for someone in your situation." 2 days later, Roger arrived at my apartment with a professional-looking presentation that included glossy brochures, financial charts, testimonials from supposed satisfied investors, and photographs of luxury resorts that he claimed were examples of his company's successful projects. The presentation was impressive and convincing, designed to overcome the kind of skepticism that someone with my banking background might have. "This resort in Costa Rica generated 45% returns for our investors last year," Roger explained, showing photographs of a beautiful beachfront property. "Our investors were able to recoup their initial investment within 18 months while maintaining ongoing ownership stakes in profitable properties." The testimonials were equally impressive, featuring statements from investors who claimed to have doubled or tripled their money through Roger's development projects. The professional quality of the materials and the specificity of the financial claims made his business seem legitimate and successful. But what ultimately convinced me wasn't Roger's presentation. It was the coordinated family pressure campaign that followed our meeting. Over the next 2 weeks, I received calls from my parents, aunts, uncles, and cousins, all praising Roger's business acumen and urging me to take advantage of his expertise. "Roger has made our family so much money over the years," my Aunt Sharon told me during one particularly persuasive conversation. "He helped us buy our vacation house, and his investment advice has been invaluable for our retirement planning." The family testimonials were overwhelming and consistent, creating the impression that Roger was a trusted and successful businessman who had been helping family members build wealth for years. Every relative I spoke with had positive things to say about his investment strategies and his track record of success. "Whitney, you'd be crazy not to work with Roger," my cousin Michael advised. "He's family, which means he has your best interests at heart, and he's proven that he can generate exceptional returns for people who trust him with their money." The message was clear and repeatedly reinforced. Roger was family. Family could be trusted in ways that strangers couldn't, and I would be making a serious mistake if I didn't take advantage of his expertise and connections to maximize the value of my lottery winnings. After 2 weeks of constant family pressure and Roger's persistent follow-up calls, I made the decision that would change everything about my financial future and my relationships with the people I had trusted most in my life. The decision to invest my entire lottery winnings with Roger wasn't made impulsively or without careful consideration, but it was ultimately made under emotional pressure and family manipulation that clouded my usual financial judgment. Despite my banking background and my instinctive caution about investment opportunities that promised unusually high returns, the coordinated family campaign had created an environment where saying no felt like rejecting my family's love and expertise. "Whitney, we're so proud of you for making this smart decision," my mother Carol said, when I finally agreed to let Roger invest my lottery prize. "You're going to look back on this as the moment when you transformed a lucky lottery win into permanent financial security for your future." The family celebration of my decision felt validating at the time, reinforcing the narrative that I was making a wise choice by trusting Roger's expertise and following their guidance. Everyone seemed genuinely excited about the investment opportunity and confident that my lottery winnings would be multiplied significantly through Roger's business ventures. Roger arranged for the money transfer to be handled through his company's investment accounts, providing documentation that showed my $960,000 being deposited into what appeared to be a legitimate business development fund. The paperwork looked professional and official, complete with account numbers, investment agreements, and projected return schedules. "Your money is going to start working immediately," Roger explained during the transfer process. "We have 3 projects starting construction next month, and your investment will be allocated across all 3 properties to diversify risk while maximizing return potential." The diversification strategy sounded prudent and professional, exactly the kind of approach I would expect from a legitimate investment firm. Roger provided detailed descriptions of each project, including location maps, architectural renderings, and market analysis reports that supported his optimistic financial projections. The first project was a luxury beach resort in Costa Rica that he claimed would cater to high-end American tourists seeking exclusive vacation experiences. The second project was a mountain lodge development in Panama that would focus on ecotourism and adventure travel markets. The third project was a commercial real estate development in Belize that would provide retail and office space for the growing expatriate community. Each of these markets is experiencing explosive growth in luxury tourism and foreign investment, Roger explained with charts and graphs that seemed to support his claims. "Our properties are positioned to capture maximum value from these trends, while providing stable income streams for investors." The presentations were convincing and professionally developed, creating the impression that Roger had done extensive research and had legitimate business relationships in these international markets. The photographs of properties and testimonials from supposed partners all reinforced the narrative that this was a sophisticated and successful business operation. For the first few months after investing my lottery winnings, everything seemed to be proceeding according to Roger's projections. He provided regular updates about construction progress, market conditions, and projected completion timelines that suggested the investments were on track to generate the promised returns. "Construction on the Costa Rica property is ahead of schedule," Roger reported during one of our monthly phone calls. "We're already receiving inquiries from potential guests, and the pre-booking numbers are exceeding our most optimistic projections." The positive updates were reassuring and seemed to validate the decision to trust Roger with my investment. He provided photographs of construction sites, correspondence with supposed contractors, and market research reports that all supported his claims about the project's progress and potential profitability. But while Roger was providing optimistic updates about the investment properties, he was also making personal purchases that should have raised red flags about how he was actually using investor money. Within 6 months of receiving my investment, Roger had bought an $800,000 mansion in one of the city's most exclusive neighborhoods, claiming it was necessary for his business operations and client entertainment. Successful real estate development requires the right image and the ability to entertain clients in appropriate settings, Roger explained when family members commented on his expensive new home. "This house is essentially a business investment that will help us close more deals and attract additional investors." The explanation seemed plausible at the time, especially since Roger was reportedly managing investments for multiple family members and outside investors. The mansion could arguably serve as a legitimate business expense if it was being used to generate additional investment capital and support ongoing development projects. Have you ever ignored warning signs because you wanted to believe that everything was working out according to plan? That's exactly what I was doing as I overlooked Roger's expensive lifestyle improvements while focusing on his optimistic reports about my investment performance. Roger also began recruiting additional investors from our extended family and neighborhood, using my lottery win and investment as proof of his business's legitimacy and success. Several of my parents' friends and neighbors invested significant amounts of their retirement savings based on Roger's claims about his track record and the exceptional returns he was generating. "Roger showed us the returns he's generating for Whitney's lottery money," my neighbor Mrs. Patterson told me excitedly after investing her retirement savings with him. "If he can turn $960,000 into several $1,000,000, imagine what he could do with our nest egg." The use of my investment as marketing material for additional investors was flattering, but also concerning, since it suggested that Roger needed constant new investment capital to maintain his operations. But I was reassured by the fact that other intelligent people were making similar investment decisions based on the same information I had received. The first signs of serious trouble emerged about 7 months after my initial investment, when Roger's regular update calls became less frequent, and his reports about project progress became more vague and evasive. Instead of specific construction updates and financial projections, He began providing general commentary about market conditions and regulatory challenges. "We're experiencing some temporary delays due to permit issues in Costa Rica," Roger reported during what would be his last scheduled update call. "Government bureaucracy is slowing down the construction timeline, but these are normal challenges in international development projects." The excuse sounded plausible, but the lack of specific details and the shift in Roger's communication pattern were concerning enough to make me start asking more direct questions about the status of my investment and the timeline for seeing actual returns. "Roger, can you provide documentation about these permit delays and revised timelines for project completion?" I asked, drawing on my banking experience to request the kind of detailed information that legitimate business operations should be able to provide easily. "Whitney, I understand your concern, but these international projects involve complex regulatory environments that can't always be documented in the ways you might expect from domestic business operations," Roger replied, deflecting my request for specific information. The evasive response was a major red flag that triggered my banking instincts about potential fraud. But before I could pursue the matter further, Roger's entire operation collapsed in the most devastating and public way possible. The call that shattered everything came on a Wednesday morning in November, exactly 8 months after I had invested my lottery winnings with Roger. I was at work at the bank when my phone rang, and the caller ID showed it was FBI Special Agent Sarah Martinez from the Financial Crimes Division. "Ms. Johnson, this is Agent Martinez with the FBI Financial Crimes Unit," she said in a professional tone that immediately made my heart race. "We need to speak with you about your investment with Roger Johnson's real estate development company. Can you come to our office this afternoon?" The moment I heard the words FBI and financial crimes, I knew that my worst fears about Roger's business were about to be confirmed in the most devastating way possible. My lottery winnings, my financial security, and my trust in my own family were about to disappear completely. When I arrived at the FBI office that afternoon, Agent Martinez explained that Roger's real estate development company was an elaborate Ponzi scheme that had defrauded dozens of investors out of millions of dollars. There were no luxury resorts under construction, no business partnerships in international markets, and no legitimate investment opportunities that could have generated the returns he had promised. Mr. Johnson used new investor money to pay fake returns to earlier investors while using the majority of funds for personal expenses, Agent Martinez explained, while showing me financial records that documented how my lottery winnings had been spent. "Your $960,000 investment was used to purchase his mansion, luxury cars, and personal lifestyle expenses, rather than any legitimate business investments." The revelation that my entire lottery prize had been stolen and spent on Roger's personal luxuries was devastating enough, but the scope of his fraud was even more shocking. He had recruited over 50 investors, including elderly retirees, young families, and middle-class savers who had trusted him with their life savings based on his claims about successful real estate developments. We estimate that Mr. Johnson defrauded investors of approximately $8 million over the past 3 years. Agent Martinez continued. "Your lottery win was used as marketing material to attract additional victims who believed his claims about generating exceptional returns for family members. Learning that my investment had been used as bait to defraud other innocent people made me feel complicit in Roger's crimes, even though I had been manipulated and victimized just like everyone else who had trusted him. The guilt and shame were overwhelming, but they were nothing compared to what happened when I tried to share this devastating news with my family. The phone call I made to my parents that evening was one of the most difficult conversations of my life, as I explained that Roger had been arrested. His business was a complete fraud, and my entire lottery prize was gone forever. I expected shock, sympathy, and shared outrage at Roger's betrayal of our family's trust. Instead, what I received was blame, criticism, and suggestions that I was somehow responsible for the disaster that had befallen our entire family. "Whitney, how could you not have researched this investment more thoroughly before putting all your money into it?" my mother Carol demanded, when I broke the news about Roger's arrest and the loss of my lottery winnings. "You work in banking. You should have known better than to trust such unrealistic promises about investment returns." The suggestion that I should have somehow detected Roger's fraud, despite the coordinated family pressure campaign and professional-looking documentation, was both unfair and incredibly hurtful. I had relied on their recommendations and testimonials when making the investment decision, but now they were treating my trust in their guidance as a character flaw. "Carol's right," my father Dennis added when he got on the phone. "You were too trusting and naive about this whole situation." This is a hard lesson about the importance of doing your own research, instead of just accepting what people tell you about investment opportunities. Have you ever been blamed for being the victim of a crime by the same people who had pressured you into the situation that made you vulnerable? That's exactly what was happening as my parents criticized me for trusting the family members who had spent weeks convincing me to invest with Roger. The victim blaming continued and intensified over the following days as more family members learned about Roger's arrest and the complete loss of everyone's investments. Instead of recognizing that we had all been manipulated by a skilled fraudster, they focused their anger and disappointment on me for not somehow preventing the disaster. Whitney should have been more suspicious when Roger promised such high returns, my Aunt Sharon said during a family phone conference where everyone discussed how to respond to the crisis. She works in banking, so she should have recognized the warning signs that the rest of us missed. The expectation that my banking experience should have made me immune to sophisticated fraud was unrealistic and unfair, especially since the family pressure campaign had been designed specifically to overcome my professional skepticism about Roger's investment claims. But the most devastating blow came when I learned that several family members were considering legal action against me for encouraging their investments in Roger's fraud scheme, despite the fact that I had never recruited anyone or promoted his business to other potential investors. Whitney's lottery win was what convinced us to trust Roger with our retirement money, my neighbor Mrs. Patterson told my mother during a conversation I overheard. If she hadn't invested with him first, we never would have believed his claims about generating such high returns. The twisted logic that made me responsible for other people's investment decisions was both legally baseless and emotionally devastating. I was being blamed not just for my own victimization, but also for somehow causing other people to make similar decisions based on their own assessments of Roger's credibility. As Thanksgiving approached, I was dreading the family gathering that would force me to face all the relatives who had lost money in Roger's scheme and who apparently held me responsible for their financial losses. But what happened at that dinner would be so much worse than I had imagined, and would ultimately motivate me to seek justice not just against Roger, but against the family members who were making me a scapegoat for their own greed and poor judgment. Thanksgiving dinner at my parents' house had always been a cherished family tradition where 3 generations gathered to share food, memories, and gratitude for our blessings. This year, it became a tribunal where I was publicly shamed and blamed for Roger's fraud, while the family members who had pressured me into investing with him acted like innocent victims of my poor judgment and naivety. I arrived at my parents' house dreading the conversations I would have to endure, but hoping that the family gathering might provide an opportunity for healing and mutual support as we all dealt with the financial and emotional aftermath of Roger's betrayal. Instead, I walked into an environment where I was treated like a pariah who had somehow orchestrated the entire disaster. "Well, if it isn't our family's lottery winner," my cousin Patricia said sarcastically, as I walked into the living room where relatives were gathered before dinner. "I hope you're proud of the investment opportunity you got us all involved in." The suggestion that I had recruited family members into Roger's scheme was both inaccurate and deliberately cruel, since everyone knew that Roger had used my lottery win as marketing material without my knowledge or consent. But the false narrative that I was somehow responsible for their losses was already established and being reinforced by multiple family members. "Patricia has a point," my Uncle David added. "Whitney should have been more careful about vetting Roger's business before putting her money into it. Her carelessness affected all of us." The dinner conversation was dominated by discussion of Roger's fraud and everyone's financial losses, but instead of focusing on his crimes or the sophisticated nature of his deception, the family consistently returned to criticizing my decision-making and suggesting that I should have somehow prevented the entire disaster. Whitney's banking background should have made her more skeptical of Roger's promises, my Aunt Margaret said during the meal. She should have done more research and asked harder questions before investing her lottery money. The repeated emphasis on my supposed professional obligations to detect fraud was particularly frustrating, because these same family members had spent weeks convincing me to override my professional skepticism and trust Roger based on their testimonials and recommendations. But the most devastating moment came when my mother Carol addressed the entire table with comments that revealed just how completely she had rewritten history to avoid taking any responsibility for the pressure campaign that had led to my investment decision. "Whitney should have researched Roger's business more thoroughly before agreeing to invest," Carol announced to the assembled relatives. "She was too trusting and didn't ask the right questions. This whole situation is a learning experience about the importance of doing your own due diligence." The suggestion that I had made the investment decision independently, without family pressure or encouragement, was a complete distortion of what had actually happened. But Carol wasn't finished rewriting history to protect herself and Dennis from any responsibility for their role in pressuring me to trust Roger. We tried to give Whitney guidance about managing her lottery winnings, Carol continued, but ultimately the decision was hers to make. She chose to put all her money with Roger, and now she has to live with the consequences of that choice. Have you ever listened to someone completely rewrite history while pretending that events you clearly remembered had never happened? That's exactly what I was experiencing as my mother portrayed herself and Dennis as innocent advisors, rather than acknowledging their weeks-long pressure campaign to convince me to invest with Roger. My father Dennis was equally committed to this revised version of events, presenting himself as someone who had offered balanced advice, rather than specifically promoting Roger's investment opportunity. We suggested that Whitney consider various options for her lottery money, Dennis told the relatives. Roger's real estate development was just one possibility we mentioned. Whitney made the final decision based on her own assessment of the opportunity. The false narrative was being established and reinforced throughout the dinner, with my parents and other family members presenting themselves as innocent parties who had been victimized by my poor judgment, rather than acknowledging their active roles in creating the pressure that had led to my investment decision. But what made the Thanksgiving dinner even more surreal and hurtful was learning that Roger himself was hosting his own lavish holiday gathering at the mansion he had purchased with stolen investor money, apparently unbothered by the fact that he had destroyed dozens of families' financial security. I heard Roger is having a big party at his new house tonight, my cousin Michael mentioned during dessert. He invited some of the extended family, but I don't think anyone's going given the current situation. The casual mention of Roger's holiday celebration was shocking, because it demonstrated how disconnected he was from the devastation he had caused, and how little remorse he felt about stealing people's life savings to fund his luxurious lifestyle. Roger's still living in that mansion he bought with our money, my Aunt Sharon said bitterly. Meanwhile, we're all dealing with financial ruin because Whitney didn't do enough research before investing with him. The continued focus on blaming me for Roger's crimes, rather than expressing outrage at his ongoing enjoyment of stolen wealth, was both frustrating and revealing about my family's priorities and their need to find a scapegoat for their own poor judgment. As the evening continued, it became clear that I wasn't just being blamed for the financial losses. I was being systematically excluded from family support and treated as someone who had betrayed everyone's trust, rather than being recognized as the primary victim of a sophisticated fraud scheme. Whitney needs to understand that actions have consequences, my cousin Robert said during a conversation I was clearly meant to overhear. She can't just make careless decisions and expect everyone else to suffer without holding her accountable. The suggestion that I should be held accountable for being victimized by fraud was both legally absurd and emotionally devastating. But it was also the moment when I realized that my family's cruelty and victim blaming was going to continue indefinitely unless I took action to protect myself and seek justice. As I drove home from that devastating Thanksgiving dinner, I made a decision that would change everything about my approach to dealing with Roger's fraud and my family's betrayal. I was going to stop accepting blame for crimes committed against me, and I was going to start using my banking background and knowledge of financial crimes to ensure that everyone who had victimized me faced appropriate consequences. The woman who had walked into that dinner feeling guilty and responsible for other people's losses was about to become someone who would use federal investigators, victim rights attorneys, and carefully documented evidence to expose the truth about what had really happened and who was actually responsible for the devastation that had affected so many innocent people. During the weeks following that humiliating Thanksgiving dinner, I began working with FBI investigators and victim rights attorneys to build comprehensive cases against both Roger's fraud and my family's role in pressuring me into making the investment that had cost me my entire lottery prize. My banking background had given me valuable insights into financial crimes, and I was determined to use that knowledge to ensure that everyone who had victimized me faced appropriate legal and financial consequences. Ms. Johnson, your case is particularly important because it demonstrates how Ponzi scheme operators use family pressure and social manipulation to overcome their victims' natural skepticism, Agent Martinez explained during one of our investigative meetings. Your family's coordinated campaign to convince you to invest with Roger is a textbook example of how these fraudsters recruit victims through trusted relationships. The FBI's recognition that I had been systematically manipulated by family members was validating and empowering, helping me understand that my investment decision had been the result of sophisticated psychological pressure rather than poor judgment or inadequate research on my part. But what proved to be even more valuable was my decision to start secretly recording conversations with family members to document their continued victim blaming and their admission that they had pressured me into investing with Roger before later denying their involvement in my decision. Whitney, you need to accept responsibility for this disaster instead of trying to blame other people, my mother Carol said during one recorded phone conversation. We gave you advice, but you're the one who decided to trust Roger with all your lottery money. The recorded denial of their pressure campaign was exactly the kind of evidence I needed to demonstrate the difference between what had actually happened and the revised history my family was promoting to protect themselves from any responsibility for the financial losses everyone had suffered. More importantly, I was also gathering evidence of conversations where family members had explicitly acknowledged their role in convincing me to invest with Roger, providing clear documentation that contradicted their current claims about having been innocent advisors who had no influence on my investment decision. We all told Whitney that Roger was trustworthy and that she should invest her lottery money with him, my father Dennis admitted during a recorded conversation where he didn't realize I was documenting his statements. We spent weeks convincing her to trust him because we believed he could multiply her winnings. Have you ever watched people incriminate themselves by telling the truth about their actions while not realizing they were being recorded? That's exactly what was happening as my family members revealed the actual sequence of events that had led to my investment with Roger. The recordings were providing comprehensive documentation of their manipulation tactics, their subsequent victim blaming, and their attempts to rewrite history to avoid taking responsibility for their own roles in the financial disaster that had affected everyone involved. Meanwhile, the federal investigation into Roger's Ponzi scheme was progressing rapidly as investigators traced the flow of investor money and documented how he had used millions of dollars in stolen funds to purchase personal assets, including his mansion, luxury cars, boats, and expensive jewelry. Roger Johnson used investor funds to purchase over $3 million in personal assets, while providing fake documentation about real estate development projects that never existed, Agent Martinez informed me during an update on the investigation. Your lottery winnings were among the first investments he diverted to personal use. Learning that my lottery prize had been among the first funds Roger had stolen for personal expenses was particularly galling, since it meant he had been planning to defraud additional investors, even as he was spending my money on his lavish lifestyle improvements. But the investigation was also revealing that Roger's fraud was much more extensive and sophisticated than anyone had initially realized. He had been operating multiple overlapping schemes for years, using new investor money to pay fake returns to earlier victims, while consistently diverting the majority of funds to personal use. We've identified over $8 million in investor losses and traced the purchase of 17 different luxury assets that were bought with stolen funds, Agent Martinez continued. The scope of this fraud makes it one of the largest Ponzi schemes we've prosecuted in this district. The massive scale of Roger's crimes meant that recovering investor losses would require seizing and liquidating all of his personal assets, including the mansion where he had been hosting lavish parties, while his victims dealt with financial ruin. As the investigation continued and the evidence mounted, I was also working with victim rights attorneys to explore civil remedies that could provide additional compensation beyond what might be recovered through the federal criminal case. Whitney, your family's role in pressuring you to invest with Roger creates potential liability for their participation in the fraud, Attorney Rebecca Chen explained during our consultation. If we can demonstrate that they knowingly promoted a fraudulent investment scheme, they could be held financially responsible for your losses. The possibility that my family members could be held legally responsible for their role in manipulating me into Roger's scheme was both satisfying and concerning, since pursuing such claims would permanently destroy any remaining family relationships. But their continued victim blaming and their refusal to acknowledge their responsibility for the pressure campaign that had led to my investment made it clear that they had no interest in taking accountability for their actions or supporting me through the recovery process. Whitney is being dramatic about money that was just luck anyway, my cousin Patricia said during another recorded conversation. She needs to stop acting like a victim and start taking responsibility for her own decisions. The dismissive attitude toward my financial losses and the continued insistence that I was somehow responsible for Roger's crimes were providing additional motivation for pursuing every available legal remedy against everyone who had contributed to my victimization. 6 months after Roger's arrest, I was ready to take action that would expose his fraud, recover my stolen assets, and demonstrate to my family that their victim blaming and emotional manipulation would have serious consequences they had never anticipated. The plan I had developed with federal investigators and my legal team was designed to maximize the recovery of stolen assets, while sending a clear message to everyone who had participated in victimizing me that their actions would not go unpunished. Roger's arrest would happen during his New Year's Eve party at the mansion he had purchased with stolen investor money, providing the most dramatic and public demonstration possible of how his criminal lifestyle was about to end permanently. But the timing was also strategic, since many of my family members who had pressured me into investing with Roger while later blaming me for the losses would be attending his party, giving them front row seats to witness the consequences of the fraud they had helped facilitate. The New Year's Eve party that would bring Roger's fraudulent empire to its dramatic conclusion was held at the $800,000 mansion he had purchased with my lottery winnings and other stolen investor money. The lavish celebration was intended to showcase his continued success and prosperity, but instead it would become the setting for his arrest and the beginning of comprehensive asset forfeiture that would help compensate his victims. I had been invited to the party by several family members who apparently believed that attending Roger's celebration would demonstrate their continued loyalty to him, despite the federal investigation that everyone knew was ongoing. Their decision to support him socially while continuing to blame me for the financial disaster he had created was the final evidence I needed of their complete moral bankruptcy. "Whitney, you should come to Roger's party tonight," my cousin Michael had called to suggest that morning. "It would be good for the family to show unity during this difficult time, and Roger specifically asked me to invite you." The suggestion that I should attend a party hosted by the man who had stolen my lottery winnings was both offensive and strategically useful, since my presence at the event would allow me to witness his arrest while demonstrating to federal investigators that I was committed to seeing justice served. "I'll be there," I replied, knowing that this would be the most satisfying evening of my entire life as I watched Roger's criminal empire collapse in front of the family members who had enabled his fraud while blaming me for being his victim. The mansion that Roger had purchased with stolen investor money was even more luxurious and expensive than I had imagined, featuring marble floors, crystal chandeliers, a wine cellar, and grounds that included a swimming pool, tennis court, and elaborate gardens maintained by professional landscaping services. "This house is incredible," I heard my Aunt Sharon telling other party guests as they toured the property. "Roger has done so well with his real estate developments. It's such a shame that the government investigation is causing him so much stress." The casual dismissal of the federal fraud investigation as stress, rather than appropriate law enforcement response to serious crimes, was typical of my family's continued support for Roger while they blamed me for the financial losses his crimes had caused. The party guests included not only extended family members, but also some of Roger's victims, who apparently still believed his claims about temporary regulatory delays, rather than accepting that they had been defrauded. The cognitive dissonance of people celebrating with the man who had stolen their life savings was both tragic and infuriating. Roger assured us that the Costa Rica project is just delayed by government red tape, I overheard Mrs. Patterson telling another neighbor who had invested with him. "Once these regulatory issues are resolved, we'll start seeing the returns he promised." Have you ever watched people refuse to accept obvious reality because the truth was too devastating to acknowledge? That's exactly what I was witnessing as Roger's victims continued to believe his lies even while federal investigators were preparing to arrest him for their systematic defrauding. At exactly 11:30 p.m., 30 minutes before midnight, and the beginning of the new year that Roger would spend in federal custody, FBI agents and federal marshals surrounded the mansion and began executing search and arrest warrants that would end his fraudulent operations permanently. "Roger Johnson, you are under arrest for operating a Ponzi scheme, securities fraud, wire fraud, and money laundering," Agent Martinez announced as she placed handcuffs on Roger in front of his shocked party guests. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The silence that followed Roger's arrest was absolute and profound, as over 50 party guests processed what they were witnessing. The man they had been celebrating was being arrested for federal crimes that had destroyed dozens of families' financial security. "This house and all other assets purchased with stolen investor funds are being seized by the federal government," another agent announced, as the asset forfeiture team began documenting Roger's luxury possessions. "All guests need to leave the premises immediately while we secure the scene." The systematic seizure of Roger's assets was both efficient and thorough, with federal agents photographing and cataloging everything from his expensive furniture to his luxury cars to his boat and recreational vehicles. Every item he had purchased with stolen money was being recovered for eventual liquidation and distribution to his victims. But the most satisfying aspect of Roger's arrest was watching the reactions of my family members, who had spent months blaming me for his crimes, while refusing to acknowledge their own roles in pressuring me to invest with him. "This is impossible," my mother Carol said, as she watched Roger being led away in handcuffs. "Roger is a successful businessman who's helped our family for years. There must be some kind of misunderstanding." The denial and shock were exactly what I had expected from family members who had invested so much emotional energy in blaming me for the disaster that they couldn't accept the reality that Roger was a criminal who had systematically defrauded everyone who trusted him. "Whitney, did you know this was going to happen?" my father Dennis asked as we were being escorted from the mansion by federal agents. "Did you have something to do with Roger's arrest?" The accusation that I had somehow orchestrated Roger's arrest, rather than simply cooperating with federal investigators, was typical of my family's continued refusal to acknowledge that I had been his primary victim, rather than his accomplice. "I cooperated with the FBI investigation into the fraud that cost me my entire lottery prize," I replied, finally feeling empowered to speak honestly about my role in ensuring that Roger faced justice for his crimes. As we stood outside the mansion watching federal agents load Roger into a transport vehicle, while asset forfeiture teams continued documenting his stolen luxury possessions, I realized that this moment represented not just the end of Roger's criminal enterprise, but also the beginning of my own recovery and vindication. The family members who had blamed me for being victimized by fraud were now witnessing the arrest of the actual criminal, the seizure of assets that would compensate his victims, and the beginning of legal proceedings that would expose the truth about what had really happened to everyone's investments. But more importantly, I had recordings of their conversations that documented their role in pressuring me to invest with Roger, and their subsequent attempts to rewrite history, to avoid taking responsibility for their own contributions to the financial disaster that had affected so many innocent people. The woman who had been treated as a scapegoat for other people's greed and poor judgment was about to become someone who would use the legal system to ensure that everyone who had victimized her faced appropriate consequences while she recovered not just her financial losses, but also her reputation and dignity. The comprehensive legal resolution that followed Roger's dramatic arrest moved through federal court with remarkable speed and efficiency, driven by overwhelming evidence of his crimes and the extensive documentation that investigators had gathered about his fraudulent operations and luxury lifestyle funded by stolen investor money. Roger was ultimately sentenced to 22 years in federal prison after pleading guilty to multiple felony counts, including securities fraud, wire fraud, money laundering, and operating a Ponzi scheme that had defrauded over 60 victims of approximately $8.5 million in total losses. The defendant systematically exploited the trust of family members, friends, and community members to fund an extravagant lifestyle while providing victims with false documentation about non-existent business opportunities, the federal judge said during Roger's sentencing hearing. "This represents one of the most callous and extensive fraud schemes this court has encountered." The judicial condemnation was both personally satisfying and professionally significant, creating legal precedent that would help protect other lottery winners and investment victims from similar exploitation by trusted family members who abuse their relationships to facilitate financial crimes. But perhaps more importantly, the asset forfeiture process resulted in the recovery of over $3.2 million in seized luxury assets that were liquidated and distributed to Roger's victims based on their proportional losses. My recovery of $485,000 from the seized assets, while not complete compensation for my lottery winnings, provided significant financial relief and vindication. The civil case against family members who had pressured me into investing with Roger, while later blaming me for the losses, resulted in additional settlements that acknowledged their liability for their roles in facilitating my victimization. The evidence clearly demonstrates that the defendants engaged in a coordinated campaign to overcome Ms. Johnson's professional skepticism about the investment opportunity, while later attempting to avoid responsibility for their influence on her decision, my civil attorney Rebecca Chen argued during settlement negotiations. The recorded conversations I had gathered were crucial evidence that contradicted my family's revised history about their role in my investment decision and established their liability for damages beyond what could be recovered from Roger's seized assets. My parents ultimately agreed to a settlement that included both financial compensation and a written acknowledgement of their role in pressuring me to invest with Roger, providing the vindication and accountability I had sought throughout the legal process. We acknowledged that we encouraged Whitney to invest her lottery winnings with Roger Johnson and that our recommendations influenced her decision to trust him with her money. The settlement agreement stated, "We regret our role in facilitating her financial losses and accept responsibility for the pressure we placed on her to make this investment. Have you ever received the acknowledgement and vindication you deserved after being blamed for other people's actions?" That's exactly what I experienced as my family members finally took responsibility for their roles in my victimization, rather than continuing to treat me as a scapegoat for their own poor judgment. The legal resolution also provided me with resources and motivation to establish the Lottery Winner Protection Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to educating sudden wealth recipients about investment scams and providing resources to help them avoid exploitation by trusted family members and friends. Whitney Johnson's experience demonstrates how lottery winners and other sudden wealth recipients are particularly vulnerable to investment fraud because their lack of experience with large sums of money makes them targets for sophisticated criminals, I explained during my first presentation at a financial crimes conference. The educational work became both personally healing and professionally fulfilling, allowing me to transform my victimization into advocacy that would help protect other people from similar exploitation and financial devastation. 3 years after Roger's arrest and the recovery of my stolen assets, I was invited to testify before a congressional subcommittee about the need for stronger protections for lottery winners and other sudden wealth recipients who are targeted by investment fraudsters. Ponzi scheme operators specifically target lottery winners because they know these individuals have large amounts of readily available cash and often lack experience managing significant wealth, I told the congressional panel. My case demonstrates how these criminals use family pressure and social manipulation to overcome their victims' natural skepticism about unrealistic investment promises. The legislative testimony was an opportunity to share my story with policymakers who could create systemic changes to protect vulnerable individuals from financial exploitation. But it was also personal vindication that my experience had contributed to positive changes that would benefit others. The most meaningful development was the establishment of the Roger Johnson Memorial Fund, named ironically for the criminal who had inspired its creation, which provides emergency financial assistance to investment fraud victims while their cases work through the legal system. This fund exists because Whitney Johnson refused to accept blame for being victimized and instead fought for justice that benefits not just herself, but all victims of investment fraud, Foundation board member Dr. Patricia Williams said during our annual fundraising dinner. As I reflected on the 5-year journey from lottery winner to fraud victim to successful advocate, I realized that Roger's theft of my prize money had ultimately led to outcomes that were more meaningful and impactful than simply having $960,000 in the bank. The lottery winnings that were supposed to provide personal financial security had instead become the foundation for protecting thousands of other people from similar victimization, while creating legal precedents and educational resources that would have lasting positive impact. But perhaps most importantly, I had learned that being victimized by people you trust doesn't make you weak or naive. It makes you someone who understands the importance of fighting for justice, even when the people who should support you are the ones trying to tear you down. If you're reading this and you've experienced similar financial manipulation or victim blaming from family members who should have protected you, please know that you have the right to seek justice and hold people accountable for their actions, regardless of their relationship to you. Sometimes the people who claim to have your best interests at heart are actually the ones most willing to exploit your trust and vulnerability for their own benefit. Setting boundaries with family members who manipulate and blame you isn't cruel. It's necessary for protecting yourself and ensuring that their actions have appropriate consequences. If this story resonated with your own experiences, please hit that subscribe button and share your experiences in the comments below. Have you ever been blamed for being the victim of financial crimes? How did you handle situations where family members tried to make you responsible for other people's criminal actions? Your story might help someone else who's struggling with similar victim blaming and family manipulation. Thank you for joining me on this journey from victimization to vindication and advocacy. Remember that fighting for justice isn't just about recovering what was stolen from you. It's about ensuring that criminals and their enablers face consequences while protecting other innocent people from similar harm. See you in our next story here at Her Sweet Revenge.